Okay, as people are coming in, I'm going to get started with some brief remarks at the beginning. It's great to see a packed house here. I think people will be coming in, so we might have to scooch, so to speak, and I appreciate everyone being willing to do that. I'm Anna Andrzejewski. I'm a professor in the Department of Art History and chair of the Art History Department's Centennial Committee. The department is really honored, as I'll talk about in a second, to have the great privilege of being here for 100 years. It's pretty extraordinary. Before I begin, I want to thank our sponsors for the program. This event tonight is sponsored by the Anonymous Fund at the university, along with support of the Dean's Office in the College of Letters and Science, and also generous support of the donors of the Department of Art History. I also want to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of our wonderful partners for this event, the Chazen Museum of Art. We could not do this without them. I also would like to extend my gratitude to the incredible staff in the Department of Art History. That includes Peggy Hacker, Teddy Call, and Jane McCartney. And in fact, without Jane's assistance, this would not have been possible today. So thank you to Jane. I also want to acknowledge Audio of the Arts, who is here filming today. They do a wonderful job for our guests online. And finally, support of the Chazen, specifically Barrett Ness and Jamie Prey. And for those of you that have a little bit of time after our panel today, the Chazen and its collections are open until 7 p.m. So please take advantage to enjoy that. So with those preliminaries, tonight's event is part of a series that we're doing in association with the Centennial, which we're calling Art History at 100. This year, during what we're calling our Centennial Year, leading up to the formal marking of our department's 100th anniversary in September, we've hosted a series of events in which we bring back our distinguished alumni. This is the second of 3 alumni panels that we'll have. Look for our third in April. Please sign up if you haven't for our departmental newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter. Or visit us on our socials. These panels where we bring back these alumni are in part to toot our horn, to talk about our successes, and certainly we'll hear from 3 of our distinguished alumni tonight. But we also went into this thinking about inviting folks back who are active in the field that can help us think about our next 100 years. And I think the way the panel discussion will go tonight will offer us a chance to do that. Our guests for our panel today, I would say, epitomize the distinguished and distinguished alumni. All 3 work as curators in leading museum collections, having stewarded these very important collections and curated some remarkable and field-changing exhibitions. And for me personally, and I was just doing a little bit of research in the archives, I had 2 of the 3 in a class. I won't say the year. They did not know one another in that class. And I was on the committees of at least one and advised an honors thesis. So it's like really weird to be up here for that. But I'd like to introduce them in turn before turning it over to my colleague, Professor Jill Casid, in the Department of Art History and the Chief Curator of the Chazen Museum of Art, Katherine Alcauskas, who will lead us today. So if you could just sort of raise your hand when I introduce you. These will be brief introductions. Marcela Guerrero, a 2015 Ph.D. graduate of the Department of Art History, is the DeMartini Family Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. In 2026, Guerrero, along with Drew Sawyer, will curate the 82nd edition of the Whitney Biennial, the longest-running survey of contemporary art in the United States. Most recently, she co-curated with Angelica Arbeles, Ilana Savdi, Radical Contradictions. At the Whitney, Guerrero also curated No Existe un Mundo Post-Huracán, Puerto Rican Art in the Wake of Hurricane Maria, and Martín Gutiérrez, Supremacy, and those were in 2022 and 2023, among other numerous exhibitions. Linde Lehtinen is responsible for the Huntington Library's vast photography collection of nearly 1 million images. Linde received her BA in art history from the University of Chicago and her MA and Ph.D., 2014, in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's worked for several museums, including the Getty, the Skirball Cultural Center, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She is currently co-curating exhibitions which open in 2026 for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, entitled This Land Is, ... and a series of California-based work by Chicana photographer Laura Aguilar, recently acquired by the Huntington. And finally, Drew Sawyer received a BA in Art History and Economics at UW-Madison in 2005 and a PhD in Art History from Columbia University in 2015. Drew is currently the Sondra Gilman Curator of Photography at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He has previously held positions at the Brooklyn Museum, the Columbus Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His recent curatorial projects, or some of them anyway, include Mark Amijo McKnight, Decreation, Copy Machine Manifestos, Artists Who Make Zines, and Sunil Sangiri, Here the Earth Grows Gold, and last but not least, Jimmy Desana, Submission. Please join me in extending our distinguished guests a warm welcome this evening.
So, wow, I have the privilege of asking you the first question, which is something that many of us have been wondering, at least those of us vested in your training. So each of you trained with us as part of your formation, and we'd love to hear about what aspect of that training or experience prepared you, we hope, in some way for what you're doing now, or where you see the curatorial field heading, since we're emphasizing so much transforming curatorial practice. I'll start since I'm first in the row.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Catherine, for inviting us and for having us here. Those were lovely introductions and a great question to start tonight's conversation. You know, I think to answer that question, I have to give a little bit of background. When I came to UW, and might say the years, and it was a long time ago, but I had received my bachelor's from the University of Puerto Rico. And so when I came to UW in 2003, very long time ago, I think I came, you know, with a degree in art history and history of the Americas, very solid, but also at the same time pretty general and pretty basic, I would say. And when I came here, I think I was really exposed and largely, and we've talked about this thanks to you and your courses, to you know, a wide range of critical theory, post-colonial theory, post-structuralist theory, you know, introduced to many thinkers that now in my career as a curator, you know, these are voices that artists are still responding to. You know, it's not strange to talk to an artist and the artist is referencing Glissant and Opacité, or Foucault or José Esteban Muñoz. These are all voices that were introduced to me thanks to you and the courses that I took here. And also, you know, having a background in art history and a training as an art historian in this department really gave me a breadth of knowledge, you know, studying with people like Henry Druel, Nancy Rose Marshall, I think I saw her over there, you know, with so many, Julia Murray and Andrew Jetsky. You know, I'm sorry I'm naming names because obviously I'm forgetting some. But yeah, I think, you know, we were talking earlier with some of the grad students, and I think maybe I want to venture to say that that's perhaps what differentiates us, the three of us are historians, meaning we are curators with PhDs, with training as art historians, meaning we're not curators who trained as curators. We don't have an MA in curatorial studies like some of our other colleagues. So we have this really vast range of knowledges and experiences and training that I think really differentiate us from other curators. And lastly, I'll say, you know, I was, again, with the students today kind of thinking aloud how, you know, writing a dissertation, writing a paper too, but writing a dissertation, you really have to have a methodology, a way in which you build an argument. And not surprisingly, at least when I approach my exhibitions, I do it with that same kind of structure in mind of I need to tell this story in a coherent way and go from point A to point B, almost like you're writing an essay, but in visual and spatial ways. So I think those are some, you know, some of the things that I think I've carried throughout my life since, you know, graduating from the art history program here.
Thank you.
Yes, so I want to, again, echo Marcela's thanks, and thanks to everyone being here. I think when I consider my, you know, attraction to this program, I don't even think I realized until I was talking to Anna about this. I don't even think I realized until I got to campus on the initial visit that how much the classes were actually part of the museum, and actually going into the space of going in and taking my classes here, but also knowing that I was going into a museum, I think helped, whether it was subconscious or not, to kind of say I am in a unique space that serves both purposes in many ways. And one of the first things that I actually came across here when I was an MA student was a piece that was on display in the permanent collection, and it was a work by a local artist, Martha Glowacki, and it was a contemporary curiosity cabinet, and it sparked so many things for me. This one object that was part of the space that I was going into to go to class, and then I just became fascinated with it, and then it ended up, you know, turning into visits to the Wisconsin Historical Society, because that's where she had done some of her research. It ended up turning into an artist interview to understand her process, and it ended up taking me into the space of understanding institutional critique practices and a deeper history of Wunderkammer. And so that one thing and my encounter with it here actually expanded my thinking in so many ways in terms of what a museum object can do to initiate thinking, to elevate thinking, to take you into different spaces of history and time. And that has all certainly informed my work and understanding as a curator, and how I approach collections, how I approach images, how I approach the materiality of things that I come across. So that one thing actually shaped quite a bit of my thinking. I'll say too that, and I mentioned this to the students that we were speaking with this morning, that the way in which, especially in my job as someone who works as a photography curator, but within a vast library collection, I have to think in a much more interdisciplinary way about so many things. You know, my colleagues are history of science curators, history of medicine curators. They're thinking across a lot of different spaces. And so when I began my TA-ship here, even though I was studying with Barbara Binger and looking at European modernism and American modernism, I was assigned to be the ancient to medieval TA. And I thought, okay, there's a reason they're doing this. and it was a way to work with Professor Dale, and it was really, and that made a difference too in terms of how I could flex different muscles of my, you know, again, reading images and understanding images from an area that I wasn't necessarily a specialist in, but it was a way to put me into a different zone and also begin to translate that material for students and to test that that part of myself and that part of my my thinking and my art history skills. So that allowed me to really also think about how I could extend that into my curatorial practice and deal with projects that maybe I wasn't as familiar with, but I was going to dig into. This America 250 is a good example, and we can talk about that. So it has allowed me to feel like even if it's not an area that I'm necessarily embedded in terms of a specialization, that I can still come to understand it and make it accessible to others. So those were two big components of my time here.
Hard to follow these two. Just want to say thank you to everyone again, echo everyone's thanks. And yeah, I mean, I of course agree with what Marcela and Linde have said, and especially Marcela in terms of thinking about, you know, I was an undergrad here, so slightly different, but I still feel like I was able to take cross-listed grad courses that introduced me to methodologies and theories that really stuck with me throughout my subsequent graduate work and really formed the way I continue to think as a curator and a scholar. You know, I came to UW-Madison actually to be an econ major. It was what attracted me to the school initially, and so the first kind of year and a half of coursework, I was mostly focusing on econ, and I then, you know, of course, you have to take electives, so I took a few art history classes, and it was really Nancy Rose Marshall's post-1945 class, as well as Anna's American Modernisms class, which made me want to continue to do art history, were the kind of the first courses I took. And of course, then I went on to study 20th century American art, and now I work at the Whitney Museum, which focuses on American art. So clearly, right, the coursework I took here was really important for my thinking as an art history and developing my own interests and area of expertise. But you know, Jill, I think of the class was science, hermeticism, and visual culture, which also just like blew my mind in so many different ways, both in terms of like the allowing us to do, instead of a paper, an art project. And, you know, I did not take a visual art class here at UW-Madison, which were actually quite hard to get into, as I recall, if you were not a major. So I didn't take one, but in terms of methodology, again, sort of introduction to post-colonial theory, queer theory, Foucault, so many, you know, sort of methodologies that stuck with me in my scholarship. But also I was thinking, and I was just, you know, I went to the rapid presentations of current grad students, and I was also just, you know, reflecting on the expansiveness of the department here and its approaches to material and visual culture, which also have really stuck with me. And even though, you know, I subsequently went to Columbia for my PhD, which is maybe not known for a program that emphasizes material and visual culture, but I was able, I think, to continue those interests actually outside of the department. And I took a lot of classes in anthropology, for example, at Columbia, which does have a much more kind of experimental with Michael Taussig and other people that allowed me to kind of continue. And actually, I remember reading Taussig's in that Science, Hermeticism, and Visual Culture. So there were ways that like I was able to like continue that, even though the graduate program, which, you know, I love, and I had a great time at Columbia, so I don't want to speak ill of it, but it didn't have the same. And reflecting back on it, I know I've said this to you before, but I think I didn't realize, right, how unique or lucky I was to have that experience as an undergrad, and how it really opened me up to different approaches to art history or beyond art history. And I hope you know, it's something I think a lot about in my curatorial work, and, you know, even say the Copy Machine Manifesto's Artists Who Make Zines, and thinking about, again, another format or medium that, of course, artists are using and making, but usually fall outside of the field of art history, and certainly exhibition making within art institutions, right? You might see a show on zines in a library gallery, or, you know, these other spaces, but to try to bring art into conversation with that. Or, you know, when I did the Jimmy DeSana show, similarly, I brought in a lot of ephemera, sort of correspondence art and zines and all this other material that that moved into visual culture that I think, yeah, I have to sort of say that I think it was my time here as an undergrad, more so than my graduate degree, that that sort of opened my eyes to thinking about other methodologies.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful to hear.
Great. Could you all speak about a current project or initiative that responds to changes in the curatorial practice, or that reflects changes that you're trying to make in the field?
I'll speak to one that's very concrete and very specific, which, you know, it kind of started when I joined the Whitney. My first exhibition at the Whitney, which also now it makes me reflect, and you know, it's nice to go down memory lane because I TA'd for Narciso Menocal, a course about architecture, and my first exhibition at the Whitney was around notions of space and architecture among Latinx artists who were looking back to or thinking about indigenous ideas of space and architecture in the Americas. So again, kind of, you know, I think maybe from those conversations with Narciso, kind of the ideas of space and architecture stuck with me. So for that exhibition, I proposed, I said, you know, many of the artists who were showing in this show were born in countries in Latin America. They speak Spanish at home. This is my first language. I traverse between English and Spanish. It's part of my lived experience. And obviously, I'm not the only one. It represents, you know, a major slice of this country, a huge demographic, almost 20% of the population in the U.S. Why don't we have the didactics, the didactics in both languages, in Spanish and English? And you know, I have to say, I felt some resistance for reasons that maybe we don't have to get into right now, but we did it. So that was the first show. My first show at the Whitney was the first show at the Whitney with bilingual labels, which is something that we have continued to carry on and increase throughout our exhibitions. We have a director of education, Chris Scorza, who has fully embraced this idea and has taken it forward. And so slowly but surely, we're increasing our offerings and our bilingual labels in not only temporary shows, but also permanent collection shows. And so that's a big initiative that I'm really proud that it started with my show, and thanks to the work of many other colleagues in the museum, we've continued. And yeah, I mean, it's something that I also, you know, I look back to UW again. I minored in LASIS and Latin American. I don't know why I have to explain it. This group knows what LASIS is. So I minored in LASIS. I took many courses with Guillermina de Ferrari, who's here. I TA'd a lot in the Spanish and Portuguese department. So this idea of, you know, having Spanish around me, you know, making sure that we don't lose Spanish in this country, because we know that assimilation is a real thing that has happened to, you know, our parents and grandparents. And so this idea of, you know, that the museum is a space where we can mirror what's happening outside of the steps of the museum is really important to me and the work that I'm doing. So I'm you know, that hopefully it's a direction that if not, I think I see many museums doing it. Museum of Contemporary Art in Madison has bilingual didactics, and hopefully other museums will continue to do it. It's pretty common in the rest of the world. So especially big museums, there's no reason why not to, in my opinion. So yeah.
Continue the order. Okay. So when I think about the things that I'm trying to change in my role, so I've been at the Huntington for just about a little over 3 years, and the Huntington is it's a different place from other places I've worked. It's more of a research institution. It has 12 million objects just in the library alone. It's a different animal in many ways, and photography intersects with it in ways that I'm still discovering. And I remember when I started the job, I was a little worried that I wouldn't get the job because I was too much of an art historian. And I was actually told that they were, you know, at first they were looking for librarians, and that, that they didn't, that there might be some issues, even at times, that I might be too focused on art. And I worried about that for a long time. And then when I did my job talk, I thought, well, you know what, though, I'm just going to be who I'm going to be. I'm not going to change that. And so I showed a number of different ways in which I thought the collection could be added to. And they had actually posed the question to me, what is so important and what is so powerful about a 21st century collection of photography? And that was the thing to sort of to try to answer. And so I included a range of artists, a range of material that I thought could kind of animate and change the character of the collection, which is primarily made by European American or Anglo-American makers. So that was something that I had a deep awareness of, and I wanted to be able to change. So within the first few years, I've actually been able to create an initiative just around material about histories of the Philippines, and working with my colleagues who are working on Pacific Rim material. We're collaborating together on that. And that was something that, again, I was given the support to, because we have some collections already, and it was about just expanding upon those and building those and adding to our strengths. But now I've also been able to think about not just what the Philippines is, but what the experience is of being in the Philippines, but what the experience is of being Filipino-American, which is a very different experience. And what does that work look like? And what do those contributions to photography look like? So I've been able to, recently been able to add the first Filipina-American photographer to the collection just literally a week ago. So things are changing, I'm hoping. And then I've also added work that is up in the galleries right now that we have in our collection of the Huntington, William Camargo and Laura Aguilar. And just to show the arc of it, the Laura Aguilar, she was born in Rosemead, which is just a few miles away from the Huntington. She was included in a show in 2008 called This Side of Paradise, about the body and the landscape in Los Angeles photography, curated by my predecessor, Jenny Watts, who did an incredible job and continues to do so. And she had contributed a work called In Sandy's Room to the exhibition, a large-scale work. And it was made for the show and printed for the show. And my understanding from working with the estate is that Laura, when she came to the opening, felt still outside of things and didn't feel as welcome as she could have. And that really stuck with me, thinking about that and hearing that story. And so we worked really hard, and it's not just me and my wonderful colleagues, and we spent time to really think about how we could right that, how we could correct that. And so we invited her family and friends, because she passed away, sadly, in 2018. But we invited them when we were able to acquire a larger body for work to honor Laura and celebrate her. And even though it was posthumously, but welcome that work back in, and be able to then acquire that particular work in Sandy's Room that had been shown in 2008 and sort of reunite it into the collection. So things like that have really been meaningful in terms of what the collection used to look like and what it's beginning to look like now. And so those are just some very specific examples of how I feel like bit by bit change is happening. But it takes time, it takes long range planning and deep relationships and conversations, and it doesn't happen overnight. And that's the other thing too that I think is so critical to the work we're doing, that we are here for the long run, and we are trying to make these changes in ways that are meaningful and that we know are going to be sustained, but it's going to take some work. So, but I think we're all here for it. So.
Great. Well, I'm fairly new to the Whitney, so I'm still kind of getting settled, although Marcela and I are working on the biennial. So, hopefully it's something we're definitely thinking about. What is the format of the biennial, and what has it been at the Whitney, and how can we question some of the practices and so we are definitely thinking about those lines, but it's still early, and we can't like, I don't know if we want to reveal anything. But I can talk maybe a little bit about some previous roles that I've had and thinking about transformations in the field. My first job, like full-time job in a museum, was at MoMA in the photography department as a fellow from 2012 to 2015, which of course really prepared me to work as a curator. It really gave me the tools that I didn't necessarily get in graduate school. But my first real job in the curatorial field was at the Columbus Museum of Art, where I was associate curator of photography. And I feel very fortunate that that museum in particular was kind of a leader, or seen as a leader in the field of kind of like visitor-centered, audience-centered approaches to both exhibition making, but also collection presentations. And they had, so this preceded me, so I'm not claiming that in any way that I initiated these things, although with colleagues, I did work with them and created some new initiatives. But I think coming from an institution like MoMA, and then to move to an institution like that and to be able to sort of expand my own kind of language of curatorial work or practices has been really important. And I think it also presaged a lot of changes that are happening elsewhere now. And I think from there I went to the Brooklyn Museum, which is, another kind of leader in the field, I would say, or model for kind of audience engagement of a particular kind. And now even being at the Whitney, and I think, Scott Rothkopf is new director, and he's been a little over a year, and he's in his role, he's really centered audiences in a way that the museum maybe had not before, which I think is interesting. And I think it shows, right, the way in which even some larger institutions that could maybe stave off the kind of visitor-centered, audience-centered approaches that maybe some people, especially in the curatorial field, thought was more the realm of education or these other departments, are now having to shift. And that might be generational, or of course, even after the pandemic, audiences have not come back fully, even in New York City. Even as tourism has come back, the attendance for museums has not rebounded in the same way. So I think now all museums are kind of finding themselves in the position of how do we move forward? How do we engage in audiences and attract audiences? And how do we attract new audiences, not just the audiences that we had and maybe lost, but also how do we expand and actually bring people that had never been into institutions before. But yeah, so at the Columbus Museum, for example, one of their major approaches that they were known for were more like participatory audience interpretation within the galleries. So every single exhibition that we did there had to have some component that included audience engagement, which some curators were down for, and others, definitely fought at different stages. And that could look, but what I took with me from that was that if I meet them halfway, or also if I'm excited about it and I start the conversation with them, then I can help shape what that looks like, right? And I think what I found is, if you're resistant to it, then it's going to happen no matter what, and then you're not going to like the result that you get because you're going to fight it, and eventually, because it's an institutional priority, it's going to win out, right? And so you're going to have some form of that audience interpretation. And they usually included, right, anything from Post-it notes that people could write responses to, or even maybe more kid-friendly kind of like games or stations. But it really transformed the way I thought. And I worked with one colleague, and we actually got a major grant to start the Center for Art and Social Engagement, which was called CASE. And that was around how do you activate the permanent collection. So we actually got one gallery that we took over, and a sort of series of collection rehangs that were usually thematic around a particular social issue that we usually worked with, like a team of various people from the community broadly that would, we would like what matters to people here in Columbus. And especially, I was not from Columbus, right? So it took kind of like doing a lot of outreach and thinking through some of the things that would be meaningful for audiences there. and my getting there was partially by, when I first arrived there, the first show I proposed and did was with Lucy Raven, who's a contemporary artist who works primarily in film and video and is very heavily research-based, and kind of dissecting documentary practices, and it really fell in line with my own interest, and I loved her work, and I brought her to Columbus, and she did a show, and she even did a small presentation, kind of artist select from the collection, and I was super proud of it. We were able to acquire her work, but whenever I would go into the gallery, it would be completely empty, So I was like, all right, well, clearly this is not resonating with anyone in Columbus, and I'm glad we were able to support Lucy and bring a work into the collection, which obviously gave her money and resources as well. But it was the first time I really had to contend with what is it, it's great that it's on my CV, but what does it mean if nobody's coming to see this exhibition or it's not resonating with audiences? So it's something I think I've continued to think about, and it's something definitely at Brooklyn Museum, and it's kind of the shows that I ended up doing there. Like the Copy Machine Manifesto's Artists Who Make Zines was about trying to think of a show that could engage audiences in new ways, but also still contribute to art history in some way. And I think that's so I'll be interested, I'm still new, as I said, to the Whitney, so I'm kind of proposing shows post-biennial, like 2028, and after, which seems both near and far. In various ways, but I'm excited to continue to think about different approaches to exhibition making that can engage new audiences through new materials. And again, like my interest in including some of those, like zines or other ephemera is, we were talking about this with the grad students this afternoon too, and just thinking about different ways of interpretation too that don't rely on wall text and didactics, but that if you include a lot of archival material, that it helps explain the work that's there, and you actually don't need to put a wall text at all in some cases, because you're providing audiences with the context and the tools for them to understand the work better.
Well, you've pointed a little bit to this already, but I was hoping we could go a little bit deeper into, transformations and new directions in the field come with challenges, of course. And so we were hoping that you would give us an example from the work you're doing now, or work that you have in the hopper that addresses particular challenges related to where you see the field headed or where you want to see the field headed.
That's an interesting question, and I immediately thought of a show that it's up right now, the Whitney. I curated it with 2 other curators, and it's an exhibition with works from the permanent collection. It's called Shifting Landscapes, and it's one of these shows that it's a kind of new acquisition show without calling it a new acquisition show, but 70% of the works were acquired in the last 5 years or so, and a large percentage of those, I'll say, we have about 120 works by 80 artists, so it's a big show. And I think it's about 40% of the artists are Latinx artists, and I've been thinking a lot about, especially coming here, of the role of exhibitions as scholarship, and how my training, even though now a lot of the work I do at the Whitney is to address and bring Latinx voices to the museum, whether through the program or through acquisitions and bringing them into the collection. There's I feel a disconnect between what I'm doing and what is happening in academia and in our history programs, and the fact that there aren't that many art history programs that teach Latin American art or Latinx art, and how this, I guess, goal of mine of trying to bring more Latinx voices to the museum, hopefully, students are coming, professors are bringing their students and using those examples and those works as material, as case studies. Scholarship hopefully will stem from those examples, but what is happening if those are not finding their way, I guess, into academia or creating more, art historians with that proper training. And I was thinking also, Linde, about you, and we don't have kind of an official formal training in Latinx art or Asian American art, and how our exhibitions hopefully are filling that gap, and hopefully creating future scholars in these areas. I don't know, I took it in that direction. I don't know.
No, and I appreciate the rebuke. We should be doing that.
Yeah. I guess maybe I'll speak about a very recent challenge. And so I'm working on this. I'm co-curating the show. This land is ... Ellipses, very important. And with Josh Garrett-Davis, who's the curator of Western American history. And a challenge, for example, with that has been that basically we're looking at a very obviously broad topic, but using the occasion of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in order to explore themes of land and place and identity, but primarily through the collections at the Huntington with some select loans. And because it's such a huge topic, and because we feel like obviously inclusivity is so important, it becomes this. It's a question of, okay, but if we can't include everything, So that has become it's actually a challenge because we almost have too much to work with. The other complication of that is the Trump administration has recently put forward a committee on America at 250. It's actually embedded in one of the executive orders. And even just thinking in terms of these broader questions now of censorship and what certain versions of history are being promoted and used, and that is something that we have to really, really think hard about, and what 2026 is going to look like if this is what 2 months into this administration looks like. That is a major, major challenge for us in terms of how do we tell these stories that have not been told from our collection and from the deep, deep histories of the United States, and well beyond before 1776 and into the future. So these are pressing questions. We are part of a team. Armando Polito is our assistant curator, who has also joined the group, who used to work with Marcela at the Whitney at certain points. So this is also what happens, which in a wonderful way are the circuitry and the network and the way in which we find our way back again to each other is actually quite beautiful. And so Armando was brought onto the team, and he has added a new perspective and a new way of thinking too about this material, and he is helping us try to deal with some of these challenges. And so I think that's part of it too, is just that we are trying to find as many voices both internally as well as externally that can help us to address this huge issue of what's sort of looming, but also what we have a responsibility to share and to express and to sort of unpack about this history. So I don't have an answer yet, but it's just these are the things that the realities of what we also have to deal with when it comes to the political landscape as curators.
Yeah, I think maybe connected to what I was saying before, but also maybe to what you're talking about in terms of like funding structures and things, is something I think a lot about is the way museums have been transformed, especially since the pandemic, in so many different ways. And that I was already talking about audiences, right, dropping off and really not coming back, because of course there's so many other distractions that are available to audiences, and museums of course are now competing for attention in so many different ways, and that means museums themselves are transforming, and different departments outside of curatorial are growing at a much faster rate than curatorial, and curatorial in some museums are getting smaller, whereas, you know, say maybe digital content, marketing, audience engagement, education, development, and these other departments are growing. So I think a lot about how, you know, I don't see that as a bad thing, right? I mean, I think some of these changes are good, and I think for so long there was such a great deal of deference and power given to curatorial departments within institutions, so I don't see it as a bad shift necessarily, but I do think a lot about how curators can be proactive and participate in those discussions, which means being open to those discussions in ways that maybe previously curators, maybe generationally, have not been, or have been like adversarial to like an institutional structure. And so I do think a lot about how we can be more proactive in those things, and that's just a reality of the job too, right? Which is the challenge, that we're now not just curators and scholars, but we have to be fundraisers, and we have to be, you know, the kind of faces of institutions in social media and in events, but also in interviews. And so I think, you know, the demands of us is much greater now than ever before, and I don't see that really changing. So I think just the reality of the field is that curators have to be able to wear multiple hats now, and you have to be open to all of the various kind of demands that of the institution.
Thank you all so much. We don't want to end on a note of challenge, so I will now open it up for some questions from the audience, and Jill is going to help bring around a microphone. We do ask, I know you might have a loud voice, but we do ask that you use the microphone because this is being recorded.
Okay. I'm going to pass this over to you.
It's going to take some teamwork.
Great. Do you mind passing this down the row?
Thank you so much for these really wonderful talks. I'm a professor here of Islamic art, so you were all gone by the time I got here, I believe. But this is really wonderful to see our alums doing such wonderful things and speaking so thoughtfully about their work. I wanted to actually ask you to unpack a little bit. I was curious of this. I'm really profoundly impressed with the ways that you have integrated the community, and some of you kind of spoke to the curatorial doing things that perhaps the education department might have done in the past. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that relationship between curatorial and education, and how that impacts your work at the museum, how you kind of doing a more educational role might impact your actual research. If you could just kind of expand on like telling us about what that relationship had been and how it's changing, and also any kind of pitfalls that might pose that I can think of, but I'm not going to raise.
Do you want me to say? Yeah, I mean, I can talk about what it's looked like at various institutions. I mean, again, the Whitney I'm pretty new to, and I haven't really done like a big project, so my engagement with education has been mostly through like public programs, which is very specific. But in, you know, at Columbus Museum, which I was talking about, which has a really strong educational department and is really, the former head of that department, which really created the structure, is now the director at the Grand Rapids Museum. So she's left, but you know, one thing that she implemented was that when Curatorial proposed an exhibition, we actually had to, before even proposing the exhibition, fill out this form, which was about like an interpretation form. So we basically had to create a framework for interpreting the exhibition before we even proposed the exhibition to be approved to our curatorial colleagues, to the director. So it was really baked in from the beginning, and it was really seen as a collaboration between curatorial and education and interpretation, which really, again, kind of centered this, or at least centered an idea that this was for an audience, right? I mean, again, it's, I think the problem with that, of course, it's like, it depends on the institution. Some institutions have the resources to do a lot of audience research in advance, but if I'm just making conjectures about what an audience, an imaginary audience, an imaginary community wants or needs, or how they might interpret something, it's Columbus Museum maybe didn't have the same amount of resources, say, that the Whitney does, which I know does quite a bit of audience research, maybe more on the marketing end. I don't know if they're doing it to the same degree on the education end or interpretation end. But Brooklyn Museum was kind of similar. It was, you had to, it was the exhibition, it didn't have that kind of first form about interpretation, and I didn't have to meet with the head of interpretation to propose an exhibition, but the exhibition proposal form included a lot that was around, like, who is this for? How will I plan to frame it for an audience? Like, what is the point of the interpretation? What do I want, like, an average visitor to get out of it? Like, if I had 1 or 2 points, like, what are the points that I would want an average person to get from it? So that's kind of what it's looked like, at least the institutions I've worked at. Whether it's successful or not, it's harder for me to judge, because again, it falls on those usually interpretation education departments to kind of gather the information and assess whether it was successful or not.
Again, very different at each institution in terms of what the education department looks like. And I started in the student and teacher programs department at the Art Institute of Chicago before I came to grad school, because I wanted to understand museum structures in some form. And I remember, and I loved working with students and teachers, but I realized after a couple of years that I felt like that just was not the area of the museum that I felt like I was going to have as much reach for whatever reason at that time. So that's why I kept saying, that was sort of the beginnings of, I'd rather have a curatorial voice, that I felt like that was more where I felt a little bit more comfortable. And so in the spaces that I've worked, at SF MoMA, the education department, primarily, it was working with programs. But for example, the only reason that in the lecture I gave yesterday about talking about the Bay Area Walls program and the party with the karaoke and that was because of a collaboration with the education program. And if they didn't have the context and the connections and the insight, and to do that together, that would not have happened. So that's an example of something that we absolutely had to work deeply together on that and make sure that we got that right. At the Huntington, we're actually looking for a director of education right now. So if anyone would like to apply. And so there's some restructuring too going on. And you also have the component of docents, which adds like another, that's sort of a separate thing, but it is a thing. And so in terms of who is in contact with different visitors and what kinds of ways in which they're telling, conveying things about exhibitions or collections, because they are under the education umbrella. So that's another component to also just have an awareness of, and to be sure that you have a good relationship with docents. But I often work with our education department at the Huntington on schools and bringing in students and really trying to figure out what are the best ways that we can add to those students' experiences, whether it's behind the scenes, looking at collection objects. So those are ways in which we try to activate it for very specific school communities right now. And I think it's still growing in terms of how our collaborations can move forward with our department, especially when it comes to, we have so many Asian and Asian American communities that are coming through the Huntington, so that's an area that we work on quite closely. So there's some key areas that I think we will continue to collaborate on.
And maybe just to add a little bit more context to how I've worked with education and what I said before about didactics and translating those for that first show I did, I even said, I'll edit my own labels. I'll work, if you find me a translator or an editor, I can translate my own labels, and then that person will edit, or that person will translate, and then I'll edit. But obviously, I wasn't gonna do that for every single show, and I made it very clear that you wouldn't expect that from another curator to edit their own labels. So, communicating that. Luckily, then we had this new director of education, Chris Scorza, who became an ally and said, well, labels and interpretation is part of my department, so I'm going to take over this, and thanks to her, she's run, she runs everything. She gets the outside translators, the outside editors. For my a show I did on Puerto Rican art, they were as thoughtful as to hire Puerto Rican translators who would get the tone, who would get the slang, and I'm very proud of what they did. And also it was kind of a very, not only made sense because interpretation is under education, but it was also a strategic move, because at the time the director of education had a direct line to the director, whereas when I first did the first exhibition, I was an assistant curator. Now I'm a full curator, but at that time it was very helpful to have someone with kind of a more senior person be the one saying, yes, we are doing this.
Thank you guys so much. My question is sparked off something that you said, Drew, but I'm interested in all three of your perspectives. You were asking how to move beyond wall text and didactics. And for example, if you're bringing a topic, which sadly, let's say Palestine, that's not a topic of space that is given to a lot of art institutions, and sadly, increasingly academic. But let's say there was an art exhibit that had a heavy component of that, and there isn't, for let's say a lot of the visitors, the ability to have the historical linguistic knowledge to understand and grasp it. Are there ways that you've discovered to move beyond wall text and didactics? I'm really curious.
I mean, so there are some ways, and this is for the this Linde show. Actually, that's one way we're trying to sort through some of those issues. I still struggle with that because there are different attention span these days, and even before it's even less. So even if you have an alternate to the label, like QR codes is a thing, and I'm still a little on the fence about those because sometimes I feel like you can use those in a strategic way. You can use them to maybe link to a specific organization. Maybe it doesn't have to be a whole paragraph about something. Maybe it's just a way to say, this is a collective that is doing this work, and this is how you can help or advocate. So that is one way you could kind of at least allow someone to sort of make a connection to something outside of it, but also lend context to what you are showing. So I think if you do that carefully, not a gallery full of QR codes, but like very strategically and carefully, I think that's one way to do that and to lend context, but to also create a kind of advocacy or level of support that one could make. I think that there are also ways that things like film and the moving image, doing shorts or documentary, little small snippets, people do tend to watch, and at least rather than read. So making some sort of, again, explanatory piece, like for example, I talked about this last night, but for the Manzanar show I worked on, we had videos of people who were in the camps, and I was able to connect them with certain photographs when they were younger, taken by Ansel Adams. So when you're looking at the photograph, you're seeing this face, because you wouldn't think it's actually at Manzanar, because he takes these very close-up portraits. I mean, we can talk about that as a thing. It's a very complicated negotiation, but he took these portraits, and it's like, but what do these mean, or where are the voices in this? And so I was able to match it with some later oral histories that were done, and so that adds a completely different dimension to your understanding of that photograph, both in terms of the historical space of that young child in many cases, and then how they were recalling those memories and those moments much later as adults. And so that seemed to make a connection that didn't require a label, and that just had the person speaking. So those are just some things I've used or am also looking into. So.
Your question resonated a lot with me because the exhibition I did on Puerto Rican art after Hurricane Maria, we had many conversations with different departments in the museum, and I think I was very had a really strong opinion that I wanted that show to not be kind of an anthropological show. I wanted it to be about the art and the emotions, and so I remember many conversations of saying, oh, well, there's so many events in Puerto Rican history and so many dates and so many laws, and obviously someone's instinct was maybe we should do a timeline. Maybe we should do a map. And then in conversations with other people from other fields, it turned out that it's kind of a joke that every book has to have a map of Puerto Rico or, a chronology of the last 100 years. So it's definitely kind of an easy trope to go there. But I was very adamant that I did not want that because, to start a show with dates, it's like, a little bit of a bummer and a turnoff. But I mean, some shows do necessitate it, or maybe that's the tone you're going for. But I wanted it, and I remember I think I gave like a Zoom talk with a course, a UW class, and I said, I think I want this show to stand and to be like any other art show. So we are going to rely on the traditional devices, I call them devices, that we have in exhibitions, meaning our intro text, section text, because I wanted to have sections, and then extended labels, and then object labels. That's it. That's what you typically would find in an exhibition. That's what we're going to use. And not more, no less, because I did want to provide more context, but also the context that I wanted to provide, I wanted it to find a very specific balance, which was to speak to the diasporic community in New York of Puerto Ricans specifically, and also Puerto Ricans coming from the island who probably have more of that information top of mind, but also, give enough information for someone who perhaps doesn't know, to give enough, and then hopefully you go home and you look for more information. The same way say you go to an exhibition about minimalist art, you're not going to get it probably from the get-go. You might have to, kind of meet me halfway. And then, so it depends on the type of show that one is doing, how much information, what is the history of that museum with that topic. So there's a lot of, things to consider, but in the case of that show, I wanted it to stand as an art history or as an art exhibition, to be valued. Maybe you don't understand what the background of this painting about a boat imploding is, but maybe just appreciate it for what it is, for this incredible painting that it is.
Right, and as you said, right, it's like, how much can you really do in the space of a wall text? I mean, the like extended label for a single object at most institutions is below 100 words, and that's going to be edited down. Even if you try to push it beyond, interpretation department, education department's going to edit it down to lower. I mean, I think Brooklyn Museum, it was like 75 words, which I understand because we already know from research that actually most visitors don't read them at all. And if they do stand in front of a wall text, they're in front of it for less than 10 seconds. So we already know that information, and that's based on a lot of research. And now if you go to a museum and you're on their Wi-Fi, the museum can track your movement. So they know how you move around a gallery, they know how quickly you move, they know where you stand in front of and how long you stand in front of a work of art. right? So there's so much information that museums have at their disposal, and we know that, you know, the vast majority of audiences are not reading wall text yet. Of course, like, we're still, I think, as art historians and people who care about facts and information, deeply committed to those forms, but I do think we have to at least push against it a little bit when we are given this amount of information that we know that most people are not engaging with them, at least on a deep level.
Hello. Can you hear me? No. It's on? Okay. Good afternoon. I have a couple questions. Two for Marcela. So, in terms of, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned telling a story, sort of like an essay in a visual and spatial ways. And then also, I guess this pertains more to, especially what you were talking about with the Puerto Rican exhibition. How do you attach, like, kind of the temporal element, and not just like how the audience moves throughout an exhibit, but then also the temporality of the objects themselves? And I also wanted to ask specifically to talk more about the exhibition that you mentioned with the architecture of indigenous architecture and space in Latin America, especially because just like to talk more about it because it seemed really cool. And also, I have also been in Guillermina de Ferrari's class, and specifically when it pertains to ruins, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about how ruins are kind of also a temporal element to architectural history in Latin America, and specifically in the Caribbean, and not just in the archaeological way, but also in its now modern sense of like what ruins mean in a lot of different countries. And I also have other question for. Okay.
Sorry about that. We'll have a chance to talk more after.
Sorry, what was the first one?
The temporality and like exhibitions and stuff like that, and like audience and how they move around the space and time, but also with like you said, like you can do a timeline, you can do all these types of things, but at the same time, like you don't want to assign a date to the objects themselves.
Well, in the case of the exhibition on Puerto Rican art, I was looking at 5 years, and this is also kind of the 5 years after the hurricane. So the hurricane happened in 2017, and the exhibition happened in 2022, and that was very specific and something I really wanted to try, in part responding to the history of exhibition making related to Puerto Rico. There had been the last major show about Puerto Rican art in a mainstream museum in the U.S. had been at the Met. It was the Met and El Museo del Barrio in 1970-something, in the mid-1970s, and it covered from Taino art all the way to the present back in the 70s. And so I wanted to try something totally different. What if we just do 5 years? What if we just focus on these 5 years? And so the way I structured the exhibition, I started with kind of the moment of the hurricane, because I had a really amazing work by Sofia Cordova, who's actually upstairs. She has a video in the Latinx show, and that kind of introduced people to a first-person perspective of the hurricane and other, incredible topics that she touches on in that video, and then with more information that was needed to understand the rest, basically how the government let down the people of Puerto Rico in the major way in which one could see that happening was the lack of power and electricity, even a year after the hurricane. So I started with that because I thought it was a good anchor for the show, and that it ended with, so it had a very loose chronological, or maybe bookends, 2 chronological bookends that I thought were helpful. It ended with 2019 with the protests that happened in Puerto Rico. So, that's, I guess, an idea of, how to, it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. It doesn't have to be totally chronological or not chronological at all. So in that sense, that methodology of bookending it with 2 kind of moments, very specific dates, was helpful. And then we can maybe talk about the ruins after the, And I'll tell you more about that, that show.
So we should end at 5:45, so if we can do this super fast, I'm going to pass the mic. We'll take one last question. If you wouldn't mind passing this down the row.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. I'm an art historian in Chinese art in the department. So I always admire curators' vision of the future, or the vision of the missing or the gap of knowledge in the field. Because you mentioned this kind of a different areas, academic versus the curatorial practice. So I'm wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit on how to kind of identify the missing information or knowledge in the field of art history. Because for my own research, I've been always inspired by new exhibitions. So that's why I really admire curators thinking about the new materials, new areas, new approach, a new perspective. Yeah.
Just thinking about that.
What? I said 2 months ago.
You haven't talked to me.
Yeah, I mean, again, to go back to maybe a project I've done, with, like Copy Machine Manifestos, Artists Who Make Zines, is thinking about, again, I mean, I think the field, and as I started talking about, my time here and just thinking about visual material culture, which have not historically been so front and center in exhibition making and, traditional art museums, especially, I would say in New York City in particular, which are maybe more conservative or traditional in their approaches to exhibition making. I think that's kind of one area where I see increasingly exhibitions in art institutions will be more interdisciplinary in that aspect. And I think in part that's also about audiences, right? The zine show, for example, I think, when I first pitched that show, and it included in the end 1,400 objects, both zines, but works in all media, so film, video, painting, sculpture, and it was really about thinking of like, how do you explain not just zines, but artists making in other media and how they're related to their zine making practices. And I hope that kind of approach is, and I think there's a lot of other curators, art historians who are working in that way, that can create new narratives or fill in gaps of cultural production that have been kind of relegated to other kinds of institutions or not to art histories at all. And I was going to say it before, but I was even thinking about the interpretation question, for example. I was thinking Jordan Nasser is a Palestinian-American artist who was in the zine show, and he makes these really beautiful, abstract, embroidered landscapes. So if you saw his work, right, they're just beautiful, formal landscapes. And of course, a wall text could tell you that he's actually referencing the landscapes of Palestine, and of course, artists like Atal Adan and others. But he's also a zine maker, and he's made hundreds of zines, which are all about Palestine. So we didn't need to include the wall text because we could include all the zines that actually explain popular culture and poetry and history in Palestine, right? So that was a way that it sort of alleviated the curatorial, like us needing to put a framework around everything, because actually the artist already has a framework around his very formal, beautiful practice of embroideries that could then be explained by this other part of his practice that is usually relegated outside of art institutions or seen as sort of separate from his art making.
When I was thinking about your question a little bit more. One of the things, this is something that I do very frequently at the Huntington, is we call them show and tells. And so It's basically a way to bring out different aspects of the collection to students, but to donors, to just anyone who would like to see some aspect of our collection in a single, we have a single space that we do this in. They're basically, though, like pop-up exhibitions, because each time I kind of engineer it a little bit differently. And so it's actually allowed me to think through the existing collection. And if I have a class or someone that comes in and says, well, we want to do, we just need a basic history of photography overview. And I actually sit there and I think about, okay, we've got what we kind of call the greatest hits, I guess. You can put those out. But then what are the things that are missing from that? And how can I kind of create a very different, I've actually been shifting my language, even just saying histories of photography, and what does that look like each time? And I can kind of make it a little different each time, and and then I find new relationships each time I do that, and it's kind of an exercise for myself as much as it is for the people that I'm showing it to, and it's a kind of condensed way of doing it, but it actually allows me to understand what is missing and what I might need to think about. And like, for example, I was able to bring in the collection the first photographic set of tarot cards that were made by B. Nettles. And, students have never, people who, they were like, what? And so, and I'm able to bring that in though with, we have, an emblem collection and other things that relate to kind of the kind of esoteric or sort of, dark magic idea of what even a tarot card could mean. So that's been kind of interesting to mix it with other parts of the collection that, again, you wouldn't think are kind of inform that particular histories of photography. Or something like, of course, we have a copy of Ed Ruscha's Every Building on the Sunset Strip, but we also have the work that was made by another artist years earlier, of a Japanese artist who did the district in Tokyo, so a very similar format. So I'm able to also bring out maybe iconic works, but then bring in things that people maybe don't realize that are also part of that story and that narrative of that work. So that has been a very actually instructive way for me to think about what needs to be filled in too.
I think that question is really kind of top of mind during the biennial, working on the biennial, because sometimes I think we curators are a little bit like fortune tellers, and so we're kind of trying to put together elucidate and elicit conversations, elucidate what we're seeing and kind of put it in, make the most sense we can in order to elicit conversations. And so with the biennial is so current that it's almost like, how do you grasp at this zeitgeist and how do you present it? And so it's a really more kind of a question mark for now, but it's really kind of present to your question about, what is it that we're gonna tell? We kind of don't know, but we'll see. Yeah.
Well, obviously we could go all evening, so I just want to thank our guests again so much for being here with us. So we're going to thank our audiences who've joined us virtually as well, and our guests have already alluded to maybe taking a moment to answer some of the questions that we didn't have a chance to answer, and I think we've got the room for a few more moments, so thanks everyone. Thank you again. And the galleries are still open, so yeah, please enjoy the museum.